Hello and welcome to That Aged Well. This week I'm joined by Alexandra Vukovich, and she has co-written a book called The World of Slavs. And this week we're going to discuss, and it may be a little bit controversial topic with the war in Ukraine going on right now, but it's really important, I think, to make this episode because it's all told by this war in Ukraine kind of fall back on the early Russian history, and that's what we're going to discuss this week, the first Russian Empire, as I call it. So, and we're going to, of course, talk about Kievan Russia, or Kievan Rus, as historians prefer to call it right now. And I want to begin, before we go into the Kiev dynasty and the founding of Kiev, I want to begin with the trading, just across Vikings came from Sweden and Norway and Denmark, but Swedes especially use the rivers in Eastern Europe to get, because that was the fastest way to Constantinople. So let's begin a little bit before the idea of founding Kiev and how the routes from Scandinavia to Constantinople and the trade, and of course then the activity in Varangian Guards and in Constantinople, and how that worked out.
Oh, thank you. And thanks for inviting me onto your podcast. So I've been working on Rus probably for the past like 15 years. And something that I think should have been obvious, and I mean is obvious to some people, but less obvious to others, is that the waterways basically make Rus what it is. It's a place or a series of places. You can look at it as a region. You can look at it in terms of the fortified towns that were founded. But you can also kind of look at it as a kind of interconnected system of places using these waterways. So these are river systems. I think probably the ones that people are most familiar with are the Volga and the Dnipro or Dnepr, which are the major river systems, but also the kind of their tributaries. And in a lot of ways in Rus writings, we get the impression very clearly that the way in which Rus kind of oriented itself was based on kind of proximity to river systems. So for example, when trading occurred, it occurred based on kind of where the river systems could feasibly take one. If one wanted to kind of go and venture beyond the known, it was the kind of river systems that helped to kind of orient trade, exchange. One of my colleagues, Nick Evans, was working on silent trade. So, for example, trade partners weren't always known. It wasn't always, for example, Constantinople or the Baltics and the Scandinavian world. Traders across Rus also went east, but east in terms of northern Eurasia. So there's this place called the Ugra, which is actually a major river that kind of takes you to Siberia. And when they would go to the Ugra, there, for example, they would have a kind of there was a system of silent trading that was in place. So that was the convention. So these trade networks essentially create Rus, but the river systems are also they also determine the various contacts that occurred across this territory. And we're looking at like a variety of trade axes, right? We're looking at obviously the northern world, so the Baltics, Scandinavia. Scandinavia, of course, becomes very prominent, not only because of all of the kind of rune stones talking about people who went in Austerweger, so to the east, but also in terms of the sagas and other tales, both kind of written down and also kind of oral tales, that kind of functionally show that these river systems brought people from the European north and then took them to various places, right? Sometimes to the Caliphate. I mean, Constantinople is obviously the major one that a lot of people have written about, not only because of the the graffiti, the little notes that our Nordic traders left, both in, well, I guess the famous one is Hagia Sophia, but also the Piraeus lions also feature these little inscriptions. But also they brought people kind of from the Mediterranean basin to the north. I mean, there's a very important Byzantine influence that moves from north to south, from kind of the Black Sea region, so the area of what's now Crimea and Kherson, areas of extremely important geostrategic importance today, because they've been in the news for very unfortunate reasons, due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But in the past also kind of served as a sort of platform, a kind of jump off point, if you will, for traders, for, I mean, really anyone, also adventure seekers, mercenaries, going in a variety of directions. And, we obviously have mentions of goods, but we also have a kind of good representation in terms of coins and kind of other small objects that are brought across these axes.
But it wasn't always safe to travel, of course. It should be easily raided, and some places you had to drag the longbows across land, which was particularly dangerous as well, because it could that way it was easy to raid someone if you had to take a boat across land to the next river, so it wasn't always safe either. So I believe that's also one of the reasons why Kiev was founded in the first place, as kind of a gas station, if you will, a little small pit stop on the way as a safe place to as well for the traders and those who came. And let's begin with talking about the foundation of Kiev, because it wasn't Slavs, from my understanding, that founded Kiev. It was Vikings, and like this may be of common knowledge, but it's my understanding that the word Rus, it means oars in Old Norse. So is that kind of a legend, or is that really that? Do we believe that is the case? And this, of course, I wanted to talk about the famous Riurik, legendary semi-mythical figure of Riurik as well, that we found in Riurik's dynasty that would lead all the way up to, and then I've used this in quotation because it kind of loosely up until Ivan the Terrible's death they would last, but of course it's questionable. But let's begin with the founding of Kiev and the semi-mythical origin of the city.
So the founding of Kiev, or the founding of a variety of these fortified places, and I call them fortified places because there is a bit of a kind of a debate about what they really are. I know that, for example, my colleague in the United States calls them kingdoms. In generally in kind of Rus scholarship, both obviously in Russian, Ukrainian, but also in English, these places have been called kind of principalities. But what we have at the kind of earliest instance is we have essentially fortified places, and fortified places in the sense that it's a place with some type of building. Oftentimes this resembles like a great hall of some sort, and then they're fortified, so they're protected. Now, the earliest ones that we know about are Staraya Ladoga in the north, but also Novgorod in the kind of far north. And so that's kind of telling, because that actually really is representative of this northern or kind of Scandinavian influence in the foundation of these places. For Kiev, it's a little bit different, because Kiev comes sort of relatively late as a fortified place. I mean, it's mentioned in the primary chronicle, and we also have the kind of archaeology of Kiev, which is pre-Christian. But the kind of expansion of Kiev, and also the kind of primacy of Kiev as a place, comes after the places in the north, which I mentioned, including Novgorod. One reason is obviously Kiev's strategic position, its strategic position on the river routes, but also it has to do with a kind of drying up of trade. So we have these kind of entrepôts or kind of depots that are founded initially as these kind of fortified places. And then we have a period where these places kind of rise to prominence. A lot of that is the result of Christianization. A lot of that is the result of, the kind of construction of masonry structures. I mean, the most famous, obviously, are the various churches that one finds from the medieval period, beginning roughly in the late 10th, but definitely the 11th century. Certainly the Saint Sophia church in Kiev, but also in Novgorod, as well as a myriad other churches, and then structures which are mentioned in the chronicles, but which no longer exist, such as the various princely palaces and this kind of thing. And so there's a kind of relationship there between trade and the foundation of these places, but there's another relationship between trade and the expansion of these places that's not so obvious, which is that once this kind of long distance trade ceases, so the inflow of these dirhams, which are being brought from, which were struck by the Abbasid Caliphate and the Samanid Emirate, once that dries up, we have a kind of settling down, if you will. These river routes continue to be thoroughfares, but not with the same intensity. And that's where one gets the kind of expansion of fortified towns into kind of larger towns and more established places in Rus. Now, what does that have to do? Well, with the Scandinavian influence, it's quite interesting in the sense that, of course, we know that many of these traders of these kind of groups were, and a lot of the time they're characterized as the kind of Viking diaspora. And this is an interesting kind of concept because, and I like it personally, because Viking diaspora implies two things. It implies a kind of point of origin, which is Scandinavia, but it also implies a kind of grouping together of various influences. Some of them clearly Slavonic speaking, but perhaps others that we don't even really know about. And this is something that actually isn't so controversial in the sense that in the primary chronicle, the Povest Fremenniklet, which recounts the kind of earliest period, it's very Kiev-centric, but it recounts kind of the earliest period of Rus. It's made up of a variety of documents. It takes an analytic form, so kind of presenting information from year to year. In the very early period of the founding of Kiev, I'm talking about kind of 9th, 10th centuries, the names of the various kind of chieftains or sort of prominent people are incredibly varied. Same thing with the Geniza document, which refers to the kind of various guarantors and folks kind of who are meant to lend money to the unfortunate trader who requires it and who's looking for a way to kind of dig himself out of a financial predicament. The people who are mentioned as kind of belonging to the land of Rus, in this case, the area of Kiev, are incredibly varied in terms of the kind of provenance of their names. So we have, for example, kind of obvious Norse names like, the famous ones from the Povest Fremenniklet are Askold, Dir, but we also have a kind of variety of names, some of which sound very Slavonic, Yaroslav, Sviatoslav, etc. And some of them kind of Slavicized Norse names like Olga, Helga, Hakon, Yakon, but then also a kind of Turkic influence as well. So we kind of have to imagine this place, at least initially, as a kind of thoroughfare that brought people from the Eurasian steppe, that brought people from kind of the Nordic world, from Scandinavia, that brought people from obviously the Byzantine world, as well as kind of Slavonic speakers. But, and this is the kind of big but, also other possible groups of people who we don't know about, right? Because the vast majority of this region was covered with thick forest. So we kind of also have to think about all of those people practicing, for example, slash and burn agriculture, who may have found themselves eventually kind of drawn to Kiev and to other fortified places. So it's one of these histories that is, I mean, seems kind of obvious initially, Slavonic, sort of Scandinavian, what's going on, but actually is quite complex once you start looking into it.
Were there already Slavic people there, or were they Slavicized, for the lack of a better word? And after a while, as they settled down, was there already people living there, like the Scythians, for example, that's a generation ago, or was there already people that we can identify as Slavs already, as I said, Slavified eventually?
I mean, there's definitely a Slavicization, and the Slavicization comes to us really due to the fact that the vast majority of the documentary evidence from this region, from the earliest periods of writing onwards, is in Slavonic, right? So the earliest writings, like the Ostromir Gospel, 11th century, but also all of the chronicles and all of the chronicle evidence, the vast majority of the birch bark letters from Novgorod, are all in Slavonic. Novgorod is a kind of exception because obviously there are a variety of documents relating to Novgorod that are in other languages. However, Novgorod also has birch bark letters, which are in Finno-Ugric languages, which, I mean, demonstrates that this kind of representation of a kind of diverse group of people, continue to exist throughout the medieval period. However, the vast majority of writing is in Slavonic. And is that representative of the population? Yes and no. I mean, to some extent, yes, in terms of how people communicated and the language that came to dominate, but also no, because textual production in the vast majority of Rus was circumscribed and really belonged to a very specific group of people, namely the monks of the monasteries and the kind of literate ecclesiastical elite. Does this necessarily mean that kind of Slavicization was, I mean, Slavicization also is very closely linked to Christianization, so the two kind of go hand in hand. Is this necessarily representative of the entire region of Rus? Probably not. It's very difficult to say, but the kind of process, first of all, of conversion can be seen actually as also the kind of encroaching process of Slavicization. So as people converted, as they perhaps were brought either voluntarily or by force to these fortified places, as Rus expanded into its own kind of hinterland, this process of Slavicization, of the making of the kind of Slavonic group, it kind of has to be seen that way as a process.
I want to talk a little bit about earlier before we go to talk about the Christianization process, of course, in a few moments. But I want to talk about early Rus as well, because it's there was an Arab traveler that would go wander far into Rus land, and that is, of course, Ibn Khaldun. And let's talk about his experience with this brute barbarians, as he would call them, and what it was like for him to meet the early Rus as well.
I mean, this is one of those kind of incredible sort of dramatic accounts that, is both, I mean, one of a kind, and also, I mean, just incredibly compelling. It's a very interesting account because it's written by somebody who obviously belongs to an extremely literate, kind of urban and urbane culture, who then finds themselves kind of traveling into this region where, in fact, there is no kind of centralized state. There are no cities. I mean, certainly not like Baghdad or Constantinople. And also the kind of social and political organization doesn't follow, for example, any of the precepts of any of the major religions of the book. I mean, you have obviously Islam present on the territory. I mean, you have Christianity, but none of these religions is yet a kind of organizing principle by which people live. And so there is that kind of element of, I guess we would call it culture shock. But there is this kind of anthropologizing attitude that Ibn Fadlan takes to this region, which is really fascinating because it's presented almost in a kind of matter-of-fact way. So yes, there are certain value judgments, right? Like he thinks that these people are really dirty. Because I remember one of his wonderful accounts is that they pass around a trough of water, and then each of them uses like the trough, and then they don't like change the water. So then the last person to use it is just basically bathing in, the spit and of his predecessors, and he's horrified by this. And it's disgusting. He also says, these people are very beautiful, but they're also just kind of gross. He makes all kinds of little kind of judgments about them, which in some ways are, I mean, they're kind of charming, right? They present this sort of attitude of someone being confronted by a way of life that is totally alien to him, and I think it's understandable, because we do the same today. Where it becomes kind of difficult is in his account of the sort of religious and ritual practices. So, for example, we have this kind of representation of idols that various traders, to whom various traders pray for prosperity. And then, of course, we have this kind of incredible account of the ritualized rape of a woman who is part of, I mean, is represented as a slave woman, but who seems both to be kind of part of the entourage of these kind of merchant trader warriors, but also has a kind of a ritual role. And it's a fascinating account, which has been read in numerous ways, but it's also a very singular account. I
So
mean,
let's talk a little bit about the burial.
yeah.
You mentioned the rape scene. So let's talk a little bit about the burial with he witnessed, because that really aligned with what the Vikings had as a burial ritual that the Vikings used to do. So let's talk a little bit about this ritual.
So in the account, there are several things which happen. Basically, somebody who is very prominent, perhaps a jarl, a kind of princely figure, has died, and he's going to be ritually interred. Well, actually, he's not going to be interred. Really, what's going to happen is that they're going to place him in a seated position in a boat, and then they're going to have a kind of ship burial where the boat is set alight. But there are a series of rituals that attend this kind of final event, and one of them is namely this ritual rape of a woman by this person's entourage, and then her murder by strangulation by other women, including a
I
woman
do believe
who...
I remember reading. Sorry for
Mhm.
interrupting. I
Sure, sure,
remember
sure.
reading that she was drugged before, so she wasn't really aware that of what was happening. She was either
Right. Yes.
drunk or she was drugged down,
Yeah.
so she wasn't aware that she was being raped and that she was gonna be buried alive with her jarl or boss, to put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not I can't remember that bit, but I mean, there are so many kind of important, kind of seemingly minor ritual elements that appear elsewhere. Um, for example, and then once she is dead, she is placed with the Jarl. on this kind of ritual seat. And then the ship set alight, and this resembles some of the Viking ship burials that are found, I mean, across the Viking world, as well as in the British Isles. I mean, there's a very famous example. There's a very famous example from England of this as well. So, you know, these are obviously very prominent people. I mean, this is a kind of burial that takes obviously a lot of effort. We have other examples, obviously, of similar burials, like these kind of burial mounds that are similar as well to Scandinavia, that are found on the kind of territory or the region of Rus. However, this one stands out because here we have an actual account of this burial. And there are several kind of ritual elements that are interesting, including, I mean, you know, a lot of attention has been given, and you know, rightly so, to the element of the elements of rape and murder as part of the ritual. I personally have worked on something which a lot of my colleagues find quite amusing, which is the ritualized seating of the deceased figure. So the deceased figure is placed on a kind of prominent seat or throne, which, and Ibn Fadlan uses the equivalent in Arabic for the word throne, just to, I mean, show prominence. We know that, for example, in quite a lot of Scandinavian burials, we get the throne of Odin as a kind of pendant that is placed with potentially that potentially kind of refers to the kind of prominence or social role of the person. But we also have other kind of Viking burials where people are placed in seated positions. So there's so much there actually that can be kind of unpicked, and that can be linked back to other accounts, as well as, for example, archaeological data. But I think what kind of draws people to this account is actually that it is a kind of full account, and it's incredibly kind of fantastical. So there's this kind of matter-of-factness to it, this kind of
I
sort of
mean, of course, you want to
yeah.
exaggerate the
Mhm.
barbarians that has, you know, aren't civilized. I mean,
Yeah.
it makes sense that it was to kind of, and of course, be entertaining at the same time to his
Yes.
Arab readers back home. So it makes sense that, and European chronicles are, of course, no strangers to this as well. So it's quite common in that era to exaggerate.
Absolutely.
And you mentioned a little bit about the religion as well. So that's sort of a little bit before the Christianization and the religion that was worshipped. And it is my understanding when I read I don't start saying George Vernadsky a while ago. He talked a little bit about religion in his
Mm.
work on Kiev and Russia, and he mentioned it's my understanding that it wasn't Norse religion that was practiced there, but they kind of had several worshippers of, for example, trees or the forest or that kind of worship of nature. So let's talk a little bit about, you know, how the religion before and the pagan religion before Christianization of Kiev.
I think, I mean, it's interesting because in earlier scholarship about Rus, there tends to be, there's a kind of tendency to kind of homogenize Rus as a kind of, as a place maybe centered around, a lot of the time centered around Kiev. But I mean, what we see in terms of archaeology especially is that we have a kind of variety of places with a variety of influences. So in Christianity is really what homogenizes Rus. I mean, it gives Rus a kind of a singular culture, as well as a specific language for kind of expressing that culture, which, I mean, obviously is articulated by a circumscribed group of people, as I mentioned before. However, in the pre-Christian period, what we see is that there are people who are already Christian, right? And different types of Christianity, because when the Rus, for example, head to Constantinople, Princess Olga's entourage in the 10th century, when they have to take an oath. Some of her entourage, they swear on the cross because they're already Christian and that's part of their belief system. And then others, they swear on their weapons because they are not Christian. So who knows what they might be practicing. There is this kind of tendency to view these religions, these pre-Christian religions, as something that's very specific to the land of Rus, because the kind of sort of deities that are mentioned in the primary chronicle, there's one called Perun, which is a kind of god that I guess controls the weather or something like that. But a lot of this is written from a much later perspective, right? So the descriptions and the very limited descriptions that we get of the kind of pre-Christian religions of Rus in Slavonic in the chronicles are very much kind of mediated by a Christian lens. I mean, they're really seen through a Christian lens. So the reality of the situation is probably actually very likely is much more diverse, with actually a very strong Scandinavian influence, obviously with the number of, for example, pendants that are found, such as Thor's hammer, I mean, definitely like Thor-like figures, as well as Odin's throne, which are found in burials, especially in the north, but also obviously a very strong Byzantine influence in the south, especially in the Black Sea region, which is very obvious in the number of burials that we see with, for example, small crosses, and in some case, Byzantine coins, but arranged in a kind of ritual manner. So perhaps looped and pierced, so perhaps sewn into clothing or worn as pendants. And also the influence of Judaism, which we always kind of tend to forget, but which is very, very present, based on at least the unfortunately Geniza letter that we have, but we can kind of extrapolate from this that there probably was some kind of Jewish community. I'm not sure how many members, but that it existed.
So let's talk about the Christianization of Kiev, because I do believe there are two stories to this. Like you got the one legendary story where the king kind of want to summon all three main religions like Islam and Christianity and Judaism, and he doesn't find anything appealing. So let's talk a little bit about the semi-legendary story of the Christianization before we go into the actual story of how Kiev was Christianized. Because I feel like we have to mention the legendary story of how how they got into Christianized in Kiev as well.
I mean, the legend I think is far more interesting than what, like, what kind of historians now.
They always are though.
No, they always are. They're always much more fun. I mean, the legend it's a very interesting one because it's like a very common kind of Indo-European legend of the kind of testing or questioning of the faiths. So essentially, it's sort of it's a tale of, well, Prince Vladimir or Volodymyr bringing together or kind of calling to the Rus court a variety of representatives of different faiths, including Islam, as well as Eastern Christianity. And Islam is no good because you can't drink, and that's not good. You want to drink, and so you can't drink alcohol. But Eastern Christianity, that's okay. You can drink. There's the issue, obviously, that
doesn't the story go that he kind of was first Eastern Christianity doesn't sound that fun, and Catholicism doesn't sound that much fun either, and there was a reason why Judaism wasn't approved. I don't remember why, but then they send some envoys to Constantinople, and they see Hagia Sophia. They're like awestruck because they believe they are in heaven, and then like come back and tell them all the stories about Hagia Sophia and how they felt like they were so close with God and something like that, and that's why he chooses Eastern Orthodoxy instead of Roman Catholicism or Judaism.
I mean, you kind of have to look at it, and you can look at it in two ways. You can look at it in terms of that like one tale, which is like a circumscribed kind of folk tale, but you can also look at it in terms of like the wider chronicle. So in the chronicle, I mean, the sort of Christianization of Rus to some extent has already been kind of prefigured because Vladimir's own grandmother, Princess Olga, became a Christian. I mean, she was baptized by Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus's hand, given the kind of rank of the belted patricians, Ostepatrikia, and hosted and feted at the palace in Constantinople. And that's where you get this kind of fantastic description of how amazing, beautiful, gilded Constantinople was and is. And then fast forward, you have this period of Sviatoslav, who is not interested in Christianity, but Vladimir, there's sort of I guess a kind of contradiction between the sort of folkloric, so like kind of folk tales of the kind of questioning of the faiths, and then the kind of analytic portion of the chronicle, which I mean shows Vladimir allied with the emperor, with the Byzantine emperor, requesting baptism and requesting a Byzantine bride. Now, baptism kind of goes hand in hand with Byzantine diplomacy, and also kind of entering the sort of Byzantine cultural sphere, political sphere, and also kind of extending economic ties. So it's kind of interesting because you have this like beautiful sort of whimsical kind of folkloric account of the questioning of the faiths, and then you have this very kind of terre-à-terre, sober account of the political machinations of Vladimir, which is less amusing, but probably closer to the actual reality of the adoption of Christianity, at least by the princely elite and the princely entourage.
I want to talk a little bit about governing Kiev and Rus because it's, and again George Mendansky mentioned that there were several mini princes governing several principalities, and then you have the kind of high king who sit in Kiev and kind of collect their taxes again. So was this the case? Was there several princes that kind of governed several principalities, and then they paid higher tax to Kiev? Was that the case?
So I think one of the reasons why we're still talking about this is because it's unclear. For example, there are colleagues who, write about the principalities and the princes of Rus. There are other colleagues who write about the kingdom of Rus. And possibly all of these are right, with other possibilities besides. And then there's usually also a kind of differentiation between the quote unquote Republic of Novgorod versus versus Kiev and
We shall
the
talk a
rest.
little bit about that one later.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a difficult one, mainly because our main kind of evidence for these places and their histories comes from the chronicles, and the chronicles themselves, especially after the 11th century, or from the 11th century onwards, become kind of very centered around specific places. So for example, the Povest Vremennych Let, the primary chronicle, becomes very Kievocentric, and in one of its manuscript forms basically is named the Kievan Chronicle. Other chronicles focus on, for example, Galicia Volhynia. There are chronicles that are dedicated to the history of Novgorod that kind of focus on those specific places, not to the exclusion of others, but that are very clearly emanating from those centers and that kind of focus on them. Was Kiev the most prominent place in Rus? I mean, it was certainly the oldest in terms of its adoption of Christianity. It's certainly its religious prestige. That's why, for example, Kiev is so important, for example, in the translation of the kind of legitimacy of Rus to well, first to Vladimir and then to Moscow, but that's another story. But in terms of kind of government, I mean, what we see in the chronicles is we see something which I have called itinerant rule. So itineracy is really important to kind of ruling Rus, being in different places and being able to kind of go to different places, face-to-face relations, being able to actually be where the action is the mode of governing Rus. We're not looking at all at a place that has a kind of a chancellery culture where, you call the shots from some kind of center, like, I'll give the example of Baghdad or Constantinople. No, this is
Was
a
in a
place.
way a commonwealth? Would that be the best description?
Not really, because Commonwealth kind of suggests like an imperial center, and it suggests a kind of center and a periphery. But what we're looking at is we're looking at a region that doesn't really have a center, or rather it has multiple centers, and each center has its kind of hinterland. Each center is expanding. Kiev has, functionally, it has a symbolic function, something that becomes more of a symbolic function, for example, in the 12th century. But at the same time, Kiev is not necessarily the only game in town. And this certainly becomes evident in the 12th century when places like Volodymyr in the north, or Halich and Volhynia in the southwest, kind of establish their own sort of prominence in Rus.
But it wasn't an empire either in the sense that we think of today.
No, not in the sense, I guess it had functionally certain imperial characteristics in the sense that it was expanding. Certainly the principalities of Rus were expanding, hence all of the kind of endless battles against the various nomadic or semi-nomadic groups that populated the kind of quote unquote Rusian hinterland, the Cumans, Polovtsi, and others besides. But the issue there is that we're looking at a place that is kind of coming into being, that is still very much inchoate, and is kind of coming into being very progressively and, kind of purposefully. But there is an element, there's an event, or series of events that arrests that development, and that is obviously the advent of the Mongols.
I want to talk a little bit about, you mentioned economic ties with Constantinople during the Christianization of Kiev. But let's talk a little bit about the relationships in general with Kiev and Constantinople and the rest of Europe, were they mostly tied with Constantinople in the international relations, or were there ties to the rest of Europe as well, or were they mainly, like I said, closing in on focusing on just one place?
I guess, yeah, it definitely all of the above, and some other places as well. But it depends on the period. So for example, Yaroslav's daughters were, my colleague and friend Talia Zayek has written about this. Yaroslav's daughters were sent kind of far and wide, including to the Kingdom of France. Others married into the Byzantine, into the kind of Byzantine imperial household. Vladimir is a very good example. However, those relations kind of cease, especially after the 11th century. And we get we still see, for example, relations with the court in Constantinople. However, we kind of, in the chronicles, we get the impression that this is now a more inward facing culture, right? And as kind of long distance trade ceases, certainly not with the intensity that we saw in the 10th century and then before that, there seems to be a kind of equal sort of slowing down of these relations. Now, for example, the Poles as well as the Hungarians are mentioned quite often, or the Czechs, in the Chronicles of Rus. So there are definitely relations with, for example, Central Europe. I mean, those continue and intensify, but it becomes a kind of regional set of relations versus something that's a bit more global.
Mm. Let's talk a little bit about the Republic of Novgorod. You mentioned it already. Let's give a little bit more background. We talked a little bit about it in our episode. I'm sure you heard it with on Ivan the Terrible, where we
Yeah.
thought that it was more of an oligarchy than an actual republic. So let's give a little bit background and relations with Kiev, and where they had did have where they allowed independence, did they pay tribute to Kiev to have this independence, or were they kind of a vassal of Kiev in this way, or was it none of those?
Um, hmm. Yes, Novgorod is a very interesting case. I don't necessarily personally believe that the political system of Novgorod was so different from anywhere else in Rus, in terms of its independence. I mean, a lot of the time, historians focus on the Veche, or the Council of Novgorod, which was made up of kind of the prominent citizens and Archbishop of Novgorod. And they could drive princes out, which they did fairly regularly. But in Kiev, similar things happened. For example, there were clearly councils of citizens and kind of inhabitants of Kiev that drove princes out. An excellent example of this is the kind of destitution and then murder of Igor Olgovich, who is a prince of Chernihiv, who is sent to rule in Kiev and then is basically driven out by the inhabitants of Kiev and eventually murdered. So we have kind of examples of some similar dynamics elsewhere in Rus. What makes the specificity of Novgorod is, first of all, that it doesn't come under the direct suzerainty of the Mongols, unlike the rest of Rus, but also that it has these kind of global trade relations, global in the sense of the Hanseatic League, and it's kind of in a different kind of cultural sphere and in a different world from the rest of Rus in terms of its trade and also in terms of some of its inhabitants, due to these kind of wide-ranging trade relations. I think a lot has been said about the political system of Novgorod, but a lot of that has to do, I think, with historiography and also political positioning. Novgorod is viewed as a kind of alternative to the autocracy and the autocratic regime that takes place, that kind of, I guess, takes hold in Moscow or Muscovy. And in the 19th century, it was presented as a kind of Republican, a kind of a potential Republican trajectory, but also a Republican model potentially for what was then the Russian Empire. A lot of this has to do with projection versus what becomes kind of obvious in the historiography, that Novgorod is also a place that is undergoing a kind of expansion, an internal expansion and an internal colonization and an outward expansion. And this is obvious from the many wars that it leads against the various Finno-Ugric nomadic and semi-nomadic groups that reside on its stated periphery.
What laid the foundation of Muscovy would be the one that would become an empire, and not necessarily Novgorod that would become the sole ruler. Is there any chance that Novgorod could, maybe an alternative universe, that Novgorod could have been the one that laid the foundation for what we know as Russian Empire?
No, and I think that has to do with, I mean, perhaps if the Mongol period never happened. I mean, Moscow and Muscovy are, and this is like an anathema to certain Russian historians, especially the kind of official historiography of the Kremlin, I suppose. But the Mongols are the kind of architects. Moscow results from the Mongols. Not, and I don't mean this in the sense of like autocracy or anything like that. I mean this in the sense that Moscow takes the kind of role of what kind of Novgorod was and what Kiev was, in a sense. in terms of a kind of a fortified place that becomes a kind of trading center and an economic powerhouse that develops into a political powerhouse. Because of Moscow's advantageous position, and also because of the kind of Muscovite princes' advantageous positions in kind of mediating relations, but also at some point, in fact, kind of dictating relations between the Golden Horde and the rest of Rus, as well as the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. I mean, Moscow gains kind of prominence as a result of that. And that is the kind of specificity of Moscow, because in fact, the kind of power balance shifts east with the advent of the Mongols. And this doesn't feature very often in kind of histories of kind of Muscovy, Russia, or the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth done by historians who come from like a Slavonic background, because they tend not to view the Mongols in a kind of wider sort of historical or kind of historiograph as a kind of wider historical phenomenon. They view them as something that's very much kind of regional. But in fact, obviously the Mongols are a global empire, largest contiguous empire in history, obviously massively important for Northern Eurasia, but really the kind of raison d'etre for Moscow.
Let's talk a little bit about the Mongol invasion of Kiev and Rus, and how, of course, how early days that kind of quote saved. I put it in quote because I'm not, again, it could, in my view, it kind of probably would have been more in the line of Battle of Tours kind of way, that it's maybe exaggerated how far in the Mongols actually could have gotten had other days still lived on. But let's talk a little bit about the Mongol invasion and how other days that kind of quote saved Europe.
Yeah, I mean, this question of, gosh, my students and if any of my students from the Peoples of the Steppe course that I teach at King's College London, if they're listening to this, they're gonna have a lot of fun with it, because this is a question that we discuss in class, for example. Why exactly did the Mongols sort of stop expanding into Europe?
And would it have been this devastating that would change history forever had the say come into Europe? And me personally, I think it probably, like I said, it probably wouldn't be come that much further, because they were already kind of huge, and kind of expansion would could have probably weakened the Mongol Empire instead of strengthening the Mongols, as we've seen in several empires before. So, in my opinion, it probably wouldn't have been this devastating as people think it would have been. But what are your thoughts on this?
I mean, I think once out of the steppe zone, it became very difficult for the Mongols to use their usual and incredibly effective battle techniques. And I mean, I think this is probably maybe less obvious for Europe, but certainly obvious, for example, in other kind of other areas where the Mongols also stopped. For example, the Mongols never invaded the south of the Indian subcontinent. They also didn't manage to conquer Japan, even though they were present in the Sea of Japan. So I think there was a kind of, and I hate to use this word, but a kind of natural sort of limit to Mongol expansion. I mean, what drove Mongol expansion was obviously, kind of their own sort of political and also obviously military ingenuity, but also the kind of continuity of the steppe zone and kind of very similar conditions along the steppe. The Mongols also didn't particularly expand into northern Eurasia. I mean, a lot of these maps that we see of the Mongol Empire, they include these kind of vast bits of Siberia. And I mean, those areas can be included in terms of the kind of trade relations that existed between sort of Mongol fortified places in northern Eurasia and then the kind of wider Siberian zone, especially the kind of the zone that's covered by the taiga forest. But there's nothing to say that the Mongols exercise direct control over this zone. And so I think, for example, for Europe, is that they eventually, eventually found themselves in both a kind of new terrain, but also in a very new set of conditions, which potentially they could have overcame by extending or perhaps overextending their military capacity. But they didn't do that. They kind of, they turned around and went back, not necessarily even cutting their losses, essentially creating a kind of border. This also, this is kind of I guess this is kind of my sort of geostrategic analysis of the situation, and kind of also economic analysis. However, in kind of official Mongol ideology, as kind of presented to us by the secret history, and also obviously the various kind of seals of the Mongol Khans, everything under Tengri, everything under heaven belonged to them anyway. There were people who recognized it, and there were those that didn't. So it's interesting how also that kind of military undertaking was then continued through diplomacy and kind of the diplomatic relations that the Mongols also instantiated with places far beyond those that they ruled.
The round option, but of course, like I said, and this is why I think it's so important to learn about early Kievan Russian history, because a certain invasion or a special military operation that goes on in Ukraine right now, and we have to discuss Putin's view, or I'm gonna say distorted view of Ukraine in history and Kievan Rus, that his belief that Russia has always had the right to Ukraine. But as I said before on the podcast, it's kind of was called Kiev Rus and not Russia Kiev. So if you go by his historical analogy, then, and of course it's ludicrous, but then it means that Kiev should be the one that ruled Russia, not the other way around, because it started in Kiev. But of course, again, it's ludicrous that we go by this analysis because once we learn to something, they have to have the right to it. But let's discuss a little bit about what Putin believes in that and his view of historical, because he's like I'm sure you've seen the Tucker Carlson interview where he talked about this. So let's talk a little bit about his distorted view on history.
So thank you very much for this question. It's something that, so in the lead up to Russia's, and this really needs to be underlined, second invasion of Ukraine, we were all kind of subjected to a sort of historiography, quote unquote, a historiography penned, a kind of official historiography penned supposedly by Mr. Putin himself, highly unlikely. And this was published on the Kremlin website. It was a kind of pseudo-historical assessment of the sort of development of Russia. And when I first read it, and this was probably, I think, maybe 6 or 8 months before Russia launched its current incursion into Ukraine, it was both remarkable in that it was sort of something that needed to exist, but also kind of unremarkable in the sense that so much of historiography about Russia and about the Russian Empire takes for granted a certain linearity, so that there is a kind of linear transfer of religious and political and kind of cultural authority from Kiev to Vladimir and then to Moscow. And a lot of this has to do with, once again, these chronicles of Rus, which are to an extent reimagined under the Muscovite Tsars. Like they're reimagined under Ivan III and then his successor, Ivan IV, or Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Terrible. These chronicles, these kind of Muscovite chronicles, they give a kind of linear impression of the development of Moscow, starting with Kiev and then kind of continuing almost seamlessly to Moscow as a result of the Mongol devastation and then the rise of Muscovy. It's interesting that historians, and here I don't blame Putin himself. A lot of historians have kind of accepted this as a sort of official historiography of the region and is kind of the only kind of possibility and the only sort of feasible possibility. And this then implies that there is a kind of cohesion between, let's say, Russia and what's now Ukraine, and that Russia actually has some kind of say in Ukraine's current project, because I don't know, historically these two areas are linked. But actually, even historically, these two areas aren't necessarily linked. It's an invention of later historiography. And what's more important is that it is directly an imperial/imperialist invention, because what it does is it kind of lays the groundwork for the kind of prominence of Muscovy and then justifies its imperial expansion. In the case of Muscovy, this imperial expansion goes east, right? Kind of conquering all of the lands of the Golden Horde and then going beyond that to the Pacific and also to the high Arctic, actually very quickly. So one thing that was very interesting to me is that in all of the kind of historiographic debates and discussions, there has been kind of very little recognition of the reality of the documents of the historiographic documents and historical documents that we're dealing with. When, for example, Putin presented Tucker Carlson with a kind of dossier of documents, sort of supposedly, justifying and showing the kind of historical basis for Russia's modern Russia's presence in Ukraine. Whether those documents are real or fake doesn't really matter. What those documents show, and what they have shown from the medieval period and early modern period onwards, is that empires find ways to kind of justify their imperialism. I mean, that is the bottom line of this story. They can produce kind of documentary evidence, and they can kind of tell tales about themselves and kind of narrativize their imperial ascendance in intriguing and in some cases very interesting and convincing ways. But that is just a kind of imperial technique, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that it's the only kind of possibility. It doesn't necessarily mean that this is something that people have to believe, or much less that they have to support. And I guess for me, as a historian, in this instance, history doesn't necessarily need to matter. Ukraine, the people of Ukraine, Ukrainians, they have a political project of a state that they're trying to that they've had, but that they're also trying to create. History doesn't invalidate that project. There are many options. The only option isn't kind of integration into some kind of greater Russian world, nor should it be for Ukraine or for anyone else.
I mean, drawn by Putin's idea, and it's almost like saying that half of Europe and Britain and North Africa belong to Italy because it once was a part of the Roman Empire. And coming to think about it, it's kind of would be a good idea because joint government in these areas. I just think that's a good idea. To recreate the Roman Empire with the current government we have. But that's just me. I think we're gonna round it up there. And
Sure.
before we go, do you have where can people find your book, The World of Slavs? And do you have any social media where people can find you? If they have any further questions about Kievan Rus, or do you have anything else you want to promote? Any website or anything in the description that you want me to share? below.
Oh, thank you very much. I mean, you can always find me on Twitter. I'm just Alexandra Vukovich. On there, obviously, if you can write to me at my King's email. But also, I just want to mention that the Worlds of the Slavs series, for which I'm a commissioning editor, is a series that is meant to feature and also to center research from Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, as well as Russian scholars, really those who have actively opposed the Putin regime, and whose voices are now both kind of being silenced in Russia, but also those who are unable to actually publish or even in this case go elsewhere. So this is a series that has a dual purpose, obviously centering scholarship, but it also has a distinctly political purpose, which is allowing scholarship to continue in these regions, in this region, and allowing these scholars to continue to interact and to produce scholarship. So,
Thank you again for coming. It's been a great pleasure to have you on this podcast. This has been Without Age 12. We are available on Twitter/X under Without Age 12. You can find us on Instagram as well and Without Age 12. You can find our podcast on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcast, wherever you can find podcasts these days. If you're on Spotify, consider giving us 5 stars, or you can give us 1 if you hated this episode. It's a free world, at least in this part of the world. And if you are an Apple Podcast, you can give us write us a review, and I will try to read it on the podcast if I find it. Thank you so much again. If you're on YouTube, please like, share, and subscribe. My name is Alan, and I'll see you next time.